Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to the show. Who is afraid of the big bad Rishi? He's the Prime Minister, of course, since Liz Truss self-immolated. Tragically, not just setting her own premiership on fire, but crashing the economy as well, with the consequences millions of people will have to, I'm afraid, be stuck with, obviously, for a very long time to come. 12 long years of Tory rule. Every single Prime Minister, every single Tory leader has ended, I would say, in quite spectacular fashion. Beginning, of course, with David Cameron after the Brexit referendum. Theresa May obviously called a snap election, which then fatally wounded her when she threw away her majority. Boris Johnson, convulsed in scandal. Liz Truss, I mean, don't think we need to go through those glory weeks. And then, of course, now Rishi Sunak. So Rishi Sunak, is he going to buck the trend? Because every single Tory leader has in the last, because it's often said all political careers end in failure. That's a cliche. But I wouldn't say failure really sums up just how badly things have gone for every single Conservative leader. A little stat I keep throwing around. You probably heard it because I keep using it over and over again. But 30% nearly of Britain's post-war prime ministers, so that's 77 years since World War II ended, 30% of Britain's post-war prime ministers have been in number 10 since 2016. I mean, that is absolute, with no change in government. So the same party stayed in power, and yet 30% of all our post-war prime ministers have been in charge in just 6 years. Absolutely ridiculous. So we've got a time, obviously, of great political instability. My argument is that the reason we have this political instability actually isn't a Tory psychodrama. A lot of political reporting treats politics as a soap opera, very EastEnders and, drama, who's up, who's down. I would say that the thread throughout the kind of disastrous failures of all the prime ministers is an economic model which stopped producing rising living standards. So if you think about the David Cameron Brexit referendum, a lot of academic research suggests that obviously 52% of people voted to leave. That includes lots of people who might be affluent or people who are struggling. But the argument of the academic research has suggested that what got it over the line was a protracted squeeze in living standards, and areas most hit by austerity were more likely to vote for leave, and that's what got it over the edge, and that's what destroyed David Cameron. Theresa May, destroyed in a snap general election. Again, public anger over stagnating living standards. Labour was seen to have the best answers to that. That's what fatally wounded her, of course. Boris Johnson, you might think, well, that was just Partygate, wasn't it? No, I don't agree with that. I think that obviously was a big proximate cause and the general scandals that engulfed him. But actually, in the earlier part of this year, as the cost of living crisis began to really bite, that also dragged Tory polling down. And that fed into a sense that a lot of Tory MPs felt, well, is he really the electoral asset we thought he was? Liz Truss doesn't really need saying. So Rishi Sunak now is, it looks like, going for austerity 2.0 after the country has already suffered the longest squeeze in living standards since Emperor Napoleon. That was quite a while ago, by the way. So what, 2 years till an election, more cuts. There's nothing left to hack away in terms of meat from public services and the welfare state. What does this mean for Rishi Sunak? Is he just going to go the same way as all his predecessors, destroyed, as I said, by an economic model, which has now led to, it was said after the financial crash, where we have a lost decade of living standards. It's now a generation. People are set by 2026 to be poorer or as well off as they were in 2008 before the financial crash hit. Absolutely unprecedented in our modern history. So we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about Rishi Sunak. We're going to talk about maybe he's an electoral asset. Maybe he's going to turn the Tory fortunes all around. Should Keir Starmer be worried? What does it mean for Labour? What does it mean for Labour's positioning? We're going to talk, of course, about Suella Braverman. I've done a lot of videos about Suella Braverman this week in terms of the scandal involving, obviously, her just putting confidential government emails from her private Gmail address, leaking stuff. But obviously, that is important, but we do need to talk about the horror that she represents, which is, of course, the scapegoating and demonizing and persecution of migrants and refugees, including a particularly horrific story, which we're going to talk about. As ever, if you're watching live, do click on the YouTube link and press like and subscribe. Hit the notification bell. That'd be lovely. Do support us on patreon.com/Unjos84. That keeps the show on the road. We're doing, as you notice, we've been doing videos every day recently. So we're going to try and keep that going, keep that momentum going. We've hit 200,000 subscribers. Very exciting. Thank you very much, everyone. And before I bring Michael Walker in, very exciting. What was I going to say? I was going to say something important there before we're going to bring him in. No, I can't remember what I was going to say. I'll just bring him in. Hey, Michael, how you doing, mate?
Yeah, I'm disappointed. I really want to hear the important thing now. I'm feeling very
but it was there in my head. It was in my head, Michael. I had it there, and then it just went.
Very interesting opening thoughts about whether this is all due to the sort of economic model not working anymore. Lots of food for thought. I was thinking that would be more, the way you'd expect that to more obviously work would be if you've got parties constantly changing, right? Because you get prime ministers elected and they can't fix the model. They can't fix the economic model and make it work for people. The fact that it's sort of like all been internal Tory psychodrama makes it a more complicated argument, but it's still an interesting one.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose the issue is that because I don't want to go into generational conflict stuff, but because I don't like it, I think it's toxic. But it's obviously the case that the base of the Tory electoral base are pensioners who represent about 1 in 4 voters. So that's their solid base. And they've been protected because of the triple lock pension, correctly, which I support. But because they've got social democracy basically preserved for them, and they tend to be socially conservative, but they've been protected from the economic shocks of the last period. So what's caused political instabilities from outside that core, isn't it?
Well, except they disproportionately voted for Brexit, didn't they?
They did. Generation. But then again, Brexit, millions of people in their 40s and 50s voted for Brexit. That's the point. Like, what got it over the edge? That's what the research was asking, because obviously you got billionaires voting for Brexit. But what got it over the edge? What got it over the line?
Yeah, it's the same thing with Trump. Sort of those key swing voters that got him over the edge were like economic discontent voters, even if that wasn't sort of the main reason most people voted for him.
Exactly. So you'd say, look at 2016. Trump had a very substantial lead for people who earned over a certain amount of money, very rich people, and he lagged behind amongst poorer voters. But what was interesting was the swing amongst poorer voters, poorer white voters. So that's what you'd have to look at. Like, why did a load of poorer white voters who voted for Obama vote for Trump? So yeah, anyway. Me and Michael, how are you feeling today, Michael? Feeling fresh?
Fresh enough.
Me and Michael were
out last night. Do I not look fresh?
No, you look very handsome chap. The left is blessed with handsome Adonises like yourself. Before we continue, look at my t-shirt. Hold on.
Oh, very nice.
It is the Brazilian elections today. Yeah, it's the Brazilian election. We will have coverage tomorrow. Been speaking to David Adler of the Progressive International, who people might know, but I'm a bit worried about it, Michael, because what happened last time in the first round is Bolsonaro's support was vastly underestimated. Well, it was underestimated by the polling, and then but Lula's was actually quite accurate, the polling. So, but it's just the polling has narrowed where it's about 1 to 2 percentage points lead for Lula, which isn't really. It's not the kind of a margin.
Yeah, Bolsonaro was underestimated in the first round, and now the polling is sort of 53-47. That's not looking great, is it?
No, it's
biggest political story in the world right now is probably Brazil, not Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak. But obviously we're
talking about that.
We talk about what we know.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, I forgot. Yeah, sorry. Just quickly. Yeah, super chats, for example. I'll read you all out at the end. Obviously, thank you very much. Keep sending them in, and I'll throw them at Michael. Okay, Michael. Let's just start. Right. Let's start with. So Labour are still ahead in the polling by a very substantial margin. Although for a long time there's this meme because commentators, including Tony Blair, during the Corbyn years said any other leader would be 20 points ahead. And that became a meme taken by Corbyn supporters when Labour were behind or didn't have a big poll lead. But then Labour were like 30 points ahead. So then all the Starmer people were like, ha, 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 Corbyn people. Stop, where's your meme now? But then Labour's lead dropped to 17 points. And people were like, the meme lives. But Labour clearly have a very, very big polling lead indeed. But underlying polling is always very interesting because it helps suggest, it often filters into the headline polling later on. So here's what might worry Labour. Who would be best at handling the economy? So this is opinion. Tories 33%, Labour on 29%. BMG, another pollster. Who do you trust more in the economy? Rishi Sunak on 41%, Keir Starmer on 30%. And best Prime Minister, Sunak leads Starmer in the best PM poll. Rishi Sunak on 31%, Keir Starmer on 27%. Now, on the economic polling, so after Black Wednesday in 1992, when Britain was ejected from the European rate mechanism, ERM, that was seen as the Tories threw away their economic credibility. But actually, by 1997, the Tories were ahead on the economy, and the Tory poll, the Tory slogan was "Britain is booming, don't let Labour ruin it." But Labour still won a landslide, so you don't actually have to be ahead on the economy in order to win an election. I suppose what might worry me is that, well, the Tories gradually clawed back economic credibility just because there was a boom in Britain in the 90s, completely unsustainable. It was a financial, led boom. We know how that ended. But what I suppose worries me is Liz Truss just crashed the economy. That they just crashed the economy like the other week. Do you know what I mean? It wasn't like, oh, we'll get years and then we've got like lots of economic growth and then we can go, well, we did have Black Wednesday, but we do have a booming economy now. Yeah. What do you think about that?
I think at this point in time, it could just be politics as vibes. I mean, like Rishi Sunak is getting a big, broad welcome from the mainstream press. He's not Liz Truss. He's a responsible, competent Tory. They've been waiting a while for this. And people associate him with furlough. People associate him with, some decent economic policies over the course of the pandemic. So I think, potentially think Rishi Sunak, we trust him. He's a fairly trusted figure. As you say, I think when they start making the tough choices, well, I don't want to repeat their language, but when they start following through on what they're calling tough choices, then
right,
might change their mind.
Just referring to that because,
when he's got to find £30 billion of cuts. So unfortunately for Rishi Sunak, when he does the inevitable, the responsible thing and cuts our public services to the bone, and maybe that will dampen his popularity. Now, of course, I am being ironic. He does not need to make any cuts whatsoever, but he probably will. And I would hope and pray that would damage his economic popularity. Otherwise, I would feel very depressed about everything, really.
There's a big bugbear of mine because last week the BBC I've done several videos on this now because I'm obsessed. Where a BBC correspondent said that he will have to make spending cuts because of the economic situation. He has to make spending cuts and tax rises. And then they responded to the complaints and gaslit everyone and went, no, we didn't say what you heard we said. It didn't happen. Very frustrating. Yeah. So, I mean, on that though, I mean, so we're going to have this autumn statement. But do you think the worry might be that they've gone in hard and that there's going to be cuts and now everyone's going to be these big swinging cuts? But it's been suggested that Jeremy Hunt, instead of like under David Cameron and George Osborne, austerity was 80% spending cuts, 20% tax rises. And they're looking at maybe 50% spending cuts and 50% tax rises. So there'll be all this hype about spending cuts and maybe then they won't be as bad. And they'll push the spending cuts till after the next election and then use that in a general election to go, well, tough choices have to be made. Does Labour have any credibility on them? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I keep reading this story. There's going to be a trap for Keir Starmer because Rishi Sunak is going to promise a load of cuts and then Labour are going to have to fall into line and say, oh, yeah, we will do the same cuts. It seems a bit bizarre to me. I mean, I think if you were at Labour, you'd just say, no, we're not going to do that. I mean, obviously, if the big story is that Rishi Sunak is going to sort of in some, four-dimensional chess say vote Labour and something will happen like when we gave you Liz Truss, which I think would essentially be the argument, right? You say, like, we've got this big costed plan. It's restored confidence in the markets. If you let Keir Starmer in and he doesn't promise to do all the spending cuts I'm promising to do, then you could have another, brief financial crash and your mortgages will go up again. I mean, if Keir Starmer wants to take that seriously, he could take the numbers at face value and say, no, look, I'm going to stick to your fiscal plan, but I'm going to do it via all tax increases on the rich. I mean, that would probably be quite a politically smart thing to do. Whether that's something Keir Starmer's going to be willing to do, I don't know. But I would be. My expectations have tended to be low for Keir Starmer, and then they often end up, reality ends up being worse than what I expected. But I would be very disappointed if Labour went into the next general election promising spending cuts after what by then it will be 14 years of austerity. So I wouldn't put it past them, but if they were to fall into this, if they're like playing sensible, smart politics, they say, no, we really want to get elected. That means we're going to agree to Rishi Sunak spending cuts would be a surprise galaxy brain move, I think.
But on that, I mean, I should say we've got a super chat here from PR. Important Insta-related question: do you believe in life after love? I think the reason for that is me and Michael were in the Admiral Duncan last night, and we sang along to a drag queen singing Cher's classic song, "Believe." Thank you, PR, for that. Yeah. So what the Tories are very adept at, though, is turning crises, which should actually, you think, be devastating or bad for them, into crises that hit the opposition. Take the financial crash. In theory, at the time, people looked at that like, well, neoliberalism's really sunk itself this time, hasn't it? How's it going to get out of this one? The banks, obviously, the pillars of kind of neoliberal ideology and all the rest of it, they crashed the economy. The Tories very much associated with that ideology. But what the Tories did is they turned that crisis into a crisis of public spending, and were like, well, we're in this mess because Labour spent too much money. And that formed the basis for austerity. And then people blamed austerity on the Labour government rather than the Tories for a long time. And what they're doing this time, I think, you can see this with James Forsyth, who is a political correspondent who is also the best friend of Rishi Sunak in our totally normal media ecosystem. And his wife was the former spokesperson for Rishi Sunak and also Boris Johnson before she resigned, in disgrace, or not in disgrace, but you know what I mean. But what he suggested is, what the Tories will do is use the Liz Truss experiment and go, if you do reckless economic plans like our leader who we had ourselves, then this is what happens to the economy. And that will happen with Keir Starmer, because he'll spend loads of money, which in ways which the markets won't like, and the same thing will happen. So do you see what I mean? They'll turn their Tory crisis into something to bludgeon Labour with.
Yeah, I mean, I think that would be the move. And I think that's, the trap that's apparently being set by Rishi Sunak, saying we're going to promise spending cuts after the next general election, and that's how we keep the books in order. I suppose it should be harder than, because the financial crisis, I totally agree with you, that should have been a crisis of neoliberal capitalism, and the Tories made it into a crisis of overspending when it had nothing to do with public spending whatsoever. But Labour had been in power for 11 years by the time the crash happened, right? So at least in people's heads, you've got Labour have been in charge for 11 years, then the crash happened. Maybe it's got something to do with Labour. I think it is going to be harder for Rishi Sunak to stand up at the next general election and blame Labour for any kind of economic woes when they've been in power for 14 years. Because I mean, that's a very strong argument from Labour, isn't it? Like, you cannot give a sort of critique of the fragility of the British economy if you've been in government for 14 years, which the Tories will have been by the time the next general election comes around. So as you know, it seems possible, but it does seem like a harder task for the Conservatives to blame this one on the left than they managed to blame the 2008 one on the left, because Labour had been in power. They haven't been in power this time around. And it's also worth, how is this different from austerity? Because obviously, living standards, we talk a lot about living standards being appalling at the moment. For many people in society, the worst period or the most depressing period was sort of 2010 to 2016, the high point of austerity. I think that the worry for the Conservatives now is austerity was always based on, you make the bottom 30% of society poorer. They're probably not going to vote Tory anyway. They might not vote at all. So it's fine to cause that pain. Now, the worry for the Tories is that mortgage rates, interest rates, inflation, these all hit people, a much broader section of society, and lots of people who would be natural Tory voters. So I think they're going to desperately be trying to get mortgage rates down, desperately trying to get inflation down before the next general election. But it's going to be harder for this crisis to sort of not be felt by a much broader section of the population than austerity was.
Should we hear from Michael Gove?
I cannot imagine anything I would rather do.
When we last met, you made it very clear that your belief was that benefits should rise in line with inflation, as Boris Johnson promised. Should they?
Well, we're going to have some very, very tough decisions to make in the autumn statement. As I mentioned earlier, Rishi's whole instinct, everything he's done in politics, is to seek to protect the vulnerable.
He just loves the poor so much, Rishi Sunak. That's what I really associate
That's what
him
motivates him. Yeah.
Really, in the morning, it's like, how can I make the life of people who are struggling that little bit better today? Do you know who reminds me of Michael Gove? Francis Urquhart from House of Cards. Do you know what I mean?
I've never seen it. I can't.
How can you?
I know. I've got nothing to say about this.
That's worrying. Well, anyway, he does remind me of him. Okay, so there's a big debate at the moment about obviously the triple lock pensions and will the Tories stop that rising in line with inflation, and what that would mean for the Tories. I mean, that for me would seem kind of suicidal, that they're in a very difficult political space and they start attacking their own core vote. But then the other is obviously the issue of benefit uprating. It was interesting, actually, the debate in Liz Truss's cabinet over that, because Jacob Rees-Mogg actually opposed not increasing benefits in line with inflation. So you even have Tory right wingers on that side. But what do you think? I mean, do you think what do you think pensions benefits? What do you think they'll do?
Yeah, it's interesting. You know, the argument of sort of like Jacob Rees-Mogg saying they should rise in line with inflation. I suppose the electoral argument says they should not increase benefits in line with inflation, but they should increase pensions in line with inflation because their voter base is pensioners more than it is working age people on low incomes. So, you know, that's one argument for doing that. I mean, all the charities are terrified about benefits not being increased in line with inflation because benefits have already been eroded dramatically over the past 12 years and people are already on the breadline. So that's going to push so many people into destitution. I mean, obviously, you know, both should rise in line with inflation. Otherwise, you know, pensioners don't deserve a pay cut. People on benefits don't deserve a pay cut. That means they have to rise in line with inflation. I've got no idea what they will do. I suppose the Jacob Rees-Mogg argument, which I was going to sort of go on to, I'm worried they'll say, look, we thought not rising benefits in line with inflation was a problem under Liz Truss because Liz Truss was giving tax cuts to the rich, and you can't give tax cuts to the rich as well as giving cuts to people's benefits. I mean, they did it actually under austerity, but apparently that's all been memory holed by everyone. But under Liz Truss, it was seen as, you know, politically difficult to do that. Now with Rishi, he can do a sort of, we're all in it together. Yes, tough decisions. I've recognized that the rich can't have it as good as they were going to have it under Liz Truss. And I've recognized that this pain is going to have to be felt across society. Obviously, there will be sort of cushioning their own voter base. So, you know, that there is a cynical way for them to make the argument that it's consistent to have raised concerns about not rating benefits in line with inflation under Truss and say, oh, the situation has changed now that Rishi Sunak is in charge. But it's, yeah. What do you think? Do you think they will or do you think they won't?
Well, by the way, I can just see there's a big debate about why I'm drinking so much water. It's the secret of eternal life. Literally, there's about 20 comments about me, how much water I'm drinking. Also, I'm slightly hungover. Well, I think I would be really, if they don't increase, if they go for the triple lock, that is such an open goal for the Labour Party, because what's kept Labour out of power is the fact it has no inroads amongst pensioners, or very little. I mean, it's astonishing what's happened in British politics in terms of demographic polarisation, because it is without precedent. So, I mean, I've said this over and over again, so people are probably quite bored of it, hearing it by now. But in 1983, young people voted for Margaret Thatcher. She had a 9-point lead amongst 18 to 24-year-olds. So when people go, well, young people are left-wing and then they become right-wing with age, that's not actually borne out by the facts. You know, in the mid-80s, Reagan's most enthusiastic support base were young people. In the 60s, the most pro-Vietnam War generation were the young, the most anti-war generation were the old. They'd seen the horror of war, to be fair, and a lot of young people maybe were idealising it. But so what's happened, you know, normally in this country, you had class definitely divisions, but if your parents voted for a political party, you were very likely to vote the same way. And what's happened in particularly the 2010s is younger people now, you know, Labour Party is hegemonic. I mean, we're talking like, even before these poll leads, you know, 60% plus. And then there were all the young people voting for the SNP and the Greens on top of that. The Tories are a fringe political party. Amongst pensioners, though, 17% supporting the Labour Party. I mean, absolute fringe party stuff. So obviously, you know, the reason for that is just because pensioners have been protected. They've got social democracy, so they vote for neoliberalism for everybody else, I'm afraid to say. That's what's happened, isn't it? Older people have social democracy, correctly. Everyone else has neoliberalism. So the people who are protected by social democracy vote for the neoliberal party, and the people who suffer neoliberalism vote for the social democratic party. So obviously, if they start unpicking social democracy for pensioners, then, you know, some of them are going to start peeling off.
I suppose already some of them appeal. I mean, yeah, it's important not to be too sweeping in one's generalizations. But I mean, I'm thinking of that there's a clip on ITV, wasn't there? I think she was a 65-year-old woman who was getting up super early to do a cleaning job, coming back too scared to put her toaster on because she was worried about the electricity bill. So pensioner poverty is a real thing. The reason we had the triple lock pension, which has increases pensions in line with either inflation or wages or 2.5%, isn't it? So it's a much stronger protection than any other element of the welfare state has. I mean, one of the reasons it came in is because the state pension was much lower in the UK than it was elsewhere. So that was almost to sort of just bring it in line with the standards elsewhere. I suppose that with pensioners, the issue isn't, that they've had these gold-plated pensions. It's that if you own a property, then your house has probably quadrupled in price over the past 10, 15 years. So it's a sort of like asset-based Keynesianism where the welfare state is your house has got very, very expensive. And that means that if the welfare state isn't keeping up, then you can remortgage your house.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, if you end up older without a house, then you are going to feel those sort of straining public services really badly.
On Labour, because at the moment, as we see, Labour had a big opportunity clearly, but they did, despite. I mean, we're not Keir Starmer fans, either of us. I think just to surprise everyone, but there was at least some semblance of a vision articulated by Labour at conference, I would say, partly handed to them on a plate by Liz Truss, and they started to, in his conference speech, Keir Starmer flirted with what I would call basic class politics, which is they're cutting taxes for the top 1%, but everybody else is suffering the consequences. And, they started having some kind of policies which kind of maybe fleshed that out a bit. I'm just wondering that they haven't really sort of built on that since conference. Even though, obviously you might argue they kind of stood to one side, don't interrupt your enemy when he's making a mistake. Maybe there's a part of that. But I suppose the problem is, Keir Starmer is sort of, his big shtick was dull competence, basically. But Rishi Sunak, even though it's astonishing, because by the time he'd finished being Chancellor, he was very unpopular, Rishi Sunak. He went from the most popular politician in the country to being quite unpopular. But now, actually, people think he's been a good Chancellor, even though he was a terrible Chancellor. But, the polling has turned around for him. So now he's got the kind of dull competence aura. And if Labour aren't hammering a clear, distinct vision, if they're making a dividing line competence, I don't think that works with Rishi Sunak anymore. But I don't think they're articulating a clear economic vision anymore in the way they started at conference.
Well, I suppose at conference it was just very comfortable for them, wasn't it? Because Liz Truss just made it easy for Labour. If you think about their response to the mini budget, it was basically, it's kind of all fine apart from that top rate of tax, which we would keep the same. I think they also said the corporation tax would not be increased. So she gave them just some really easy targets, so they didn't have to think that hard to have a class politics vision, because Liz Truss's vision was so clearly class warfare for the rich, and kind of everyone could see that. So Keir Starmer, again, was almost moving behind public opinion. Everyone hated that budget. He could sort of just take the most universally hated parts of it and say he was against them. Rishi Sunak is now going to make that slightly more hard. They're going to have to think a bit harder and potentially be a bit less reactive, because I suppose the reason politics has been quite easy for them under Liz Truss, they haven't really articulated much of a vision of what they do. They've just said, we wouldn't do this crazy thing that Liz Truss is doing. Rishi Sunak's presumably going to do less crazy things. So they're going to have to articulate more of an alternative if they want to put clear water between themselves and him. I think they're going to have to start talking about taxing the rich. That if you want to seem like you're economically responsible in the sense that, you don't think there's a magic money tree or whatever, you're going to have to say, we're tougher than the Tories when it comes to this. And we're tougher than the Tories because we're going to tax the rich who've had an easy ride for a long time. And we're going to oppose any cuts to any public services, because people do not want cuts to public services right now. Everyone can see they're crumbling around them. So I think they should have as a red line, the last thing we want to do is cut public services even more. In fact, we want to fund them more. That was what Tony Blair was promising, right? He was going to fund public services more than they had been before. Whereas I don't even hear that particularly clearly from from the Conservatives. Got distracted.
Arguably, Labour don't have a choice politically, actually, to do what you just said, because if we think about like George Osborne 2010 onwards, actually the cost of borrowing was very low. It was a real wasted, terrible opportunity. The markets basically were saying like, yeah, borrow to invest. And the whole basis of austerity, they were like, well, if we don't do austerity, Britain's credit rating will be slashed and then the cost of borrowing will soar. But Britain's credit rating was slashed in 2013 by Standard & Poor, and the cost of the gilts actually went down. The cost of borrowing went down after that, so it had no impact. So the whole thing was a myth. But now the cost of borrowing has clearly gone up. There's market anticipation of further rises in interest rates, and there's inflation. So actually now there is actually a significant chance that if you make, for example, big spending commitments without funding them, then you could get an adverse market reaction. So either Labour go into an election doing austerity, in which case, why bother voting for them really, as a dividing line? There's no dividing line then. Or they say they're going to do public investment, but without increasing taxes on the rich, which then doesn't look economically credible. And a lot of people would actually credibly say could create a market reaction. Or they have to commit to public investment, but they can only do that by increasing taxes on the rich. That's the only political option they have available to them.
And it would be incredibly popular. I suppose it might upset the relationship that Keir Starmer is trying to develop with News International. But I think that will be the big. Do we please the newspapers, or do we give a policy which is going to be vastly more popular with the public, which is the rich need to pay their way?
But also rich donors. They quite like rich donors as well, I would say. Who don't. I
suppose a lot of the policy was based on that. But I think there are sections of the rich, the more liberal end of it, who do realise that they've had an easy ride for a long time, and that a couple percentage points on their taxes is probably necessary to maintain the social contract that we have in society. I don't think that's sort of like the collective vision of capital, but I'm not sure that the donors to the Labour Party would be blocking things such as wealth taxes. I think they'd be more concerned about the time.
They've got former Tory donors coming over who probably wouldn't be very keen on that, but. Tad Canwell actually just asked, this is interesting, is there any polling on how much the social care scandal during the 2017 election changed voting patterns among older voters? This is interesting because I think there's this now, I'd say, myth of 2017, which is basically the Tories just did a catastrophic election campaign, and that's why Labour managed to take away their majority. But actually, the Tory polling didn't go down that much during the general election of 2017. And under Theresa May, they got a similar share of the vote as Margaret Thatcher. It's just Labour at the same time got a similar share of the vote as Tony Blair in 2001. So they both got what would be landslide victories for them if the other party hadn't done as well as they did. So what actually I think the polling suggests, because actually, what really happened is Labour clawed votes from lots of other sources. But actually, the Tories kept their support amongst pensioners largely, but I think voter turnout went down amongst pensioners. So more than a big defection of older voters. That's one of the things that hurt the Tories. I want to hear from Michael Gove again because I really love him.
Some people listening might be questioning, if this is, a government committed to national security, given that Suella Braverman, resigned after emailing these confidential papers from a personal email account to someone outside the government and also copying in the wrong person as well. A week later, she was back. You take a week off work if you've got the flu, not if you've committed a security breach. Has Rishi Sunak ever pointed her?
Yes, we do take security issues incredibly seriously. That's why, again, I have to be cautious in responding to the point that you understandably made about Liz's phone. And it's because we take them seriously that we have strict protocols in place that govern how information should be shared and with whom it should be shared. Suella is a first-rate, front-rank politician. She acknowledged that a mistake had been made. She is working hard in order to ensure that our borders can be made more secure and that policing is more effective. And she's a valued member of the cabinet and someone whom I admire and like.
You say that she's an effective...
Is this time? How much do you think is it filtering through? I would imagine it just looks a bit dodgy because I think anyone who's paid attention knows Suella Braverman was put there by Rishi Sunak because she's a hard right Tory. Her endorsement for him helped keep Boris Johnson off the ballot paper, and therefore the members voting Boris Johnson back in. That's what happened there. What do you think about this whole scandal? How bad is it for the Tories?
In terms of will people notice, I don't know. I suppose what Rishi Sunak wants to do is return some idea of some vision of competence to the Conservative Party. And I suppose Suella Braverman does to some degree undermine that. He clearly decided that having the right of the Conservative Party on side was more important than that. I think probably if he can prevent a civil war in the Conservative Party by the next time, by the time the election comes around, he will look a lot more competent than his predecessors. Because I think what people notice is the instability more than any particular psychodrama that's going on within the party. I mean, it's fun. I did think in the question, like she sent it to the wrong person is sort of the funnier element of that story, where it just
who then snitched on her.
Who then snitched on it? Well, because it was the wrong person. If you're CCing your supposedly secret email to the wrong person, that's a bit of a faux pas for a Home Secretary. I doubt people care that much about this story, but I can't see it. Well, I suppose also Rishi Sunak's probably thinking, look, people are worried about economic competence at the moment. She's Home Secretary. If she messes up, what's it going to do? It's going to mean a more miserable time for some asylum seekers, which it already is, by the way. A story I think we're going to talk about later. But he's hoping that doesn't have much cut through with the public anyway. I mean, Labour are trying to make this about national security. I mean, the email was about an internal policy. It was about policy on migration, I think, and how that feeds into OBR estimations. So it was sort of her emailing a backbench right-wing Tory about policy before it was announced, which is why I think it was market sensitive. So it wasn't actually a national security issue. So I'm not sure how far it will run to that extent. Is she a threat to our security? I don't know, probably not. Is she a threat to vulnerable minorities? Absolutely.
Well, I've got to ask about that. I just noticed people in the comments asking when the Michael Walker calendar drops. Just letting you know. Suella Braverman ignored legal warnings from the Home Office that she's breaking the law by keeping asylum seekers in overcrowded, disease-ridden processing centres for too long. So, I mean, this is awful. People, a breakout of diphtheria, scabies, gruesome stuff. I mean, that's the human consequences of what the so-called culture war is all about, isn't it? Which is clearly trying to tap into the worst instincts people have about refugees and migrants, which conveniently deflects anger away from the government and those who are in power, who are responsible for the ills of society. But that's the consequences. You just get people treated like, I was going to say treated like animals, but I think this would be regarded as cruelty to animals as well. I mean, it is gruesome stuff, isn't it?
I mean, it's also the victory of Nigel Farage, because I mean, if you look at the story, the reason it seems, I mean, it could just be that she's cruel and she just likes suffering, but it seems, the legal advice was you can't have people staying in this detention center for, I think it's supposed to be more than 24 hours. So you've got to understand, like, detention centers where people are held long term, conditions are appalling, but this place was considered even worse, because you are allowed to keep someone in a detention center. I mean, indefinitely. That's one of the terrible things about sort of the practices of this country and sort of what separates it from most countries in the world, which we will detain people indefinitely in detention. But those detention centers presumably meet some standards that this one didn't, because this was supposed to just be a holding center. The legal advice was you were going to have to procure some sort of long-term accommodation for these people while you deal with their claims. I think claims at the moment take 488 days to be processed because of the Tory cuts to the legal system. Obviously, judges have to be involved. Legal aid, although I imagine they probably cut legal aid by a vast amount for potential asylum seekers. But anyway, that system is sort of grinding to a halt. And the legal advice was you were going to have to put up people in. And I hate this phrase, putting up people in hotels, because it's not. You're not giving people a life of luxury. The reason you have to put up people in hotels is because the state has been completely, torn back. It's not that there's loads of sort of social housing, state accommodation which is available, but we're deciding, oh no, these people deserve the best of the best, so let's send them to hotels instead of sending them to some kind of state accommodation. The reason we send them to hotels is because we don't have any other forms of public sector accommodation. And yeah, these aren't going to be 5-star hotels anyway. I mean, if they were, it wouldn't outrage me. But this is a Nigel Farage thing, because you'll remember sort of last summer, and I think the summer before, he was constantly on his, taking his video cameras to hotels and saying, how many migrants are staying here? How much is it costing for all of them to be here? So Suella Braverman decided, I'm not going to send any migrants to hotels. So she keeps them illegally in places which aren't fit for human habitation. She thinks that's sort of checkmate Nigel Farage, but actually it's, well, maybe it is, but it's causing a lot of suffering to a lot of people.
It's interesting at the moment. My brother took in a Ukrainian family, and obviously Ukrainian refugees have received widespread public sympathy, obviously, and haven't been treated badly in the way that obviously other refugees have been treated. But it's interesting at the moment, just trying to get them proper adequate housing is actually impossible. And actually it seems as though the only way to do it is to make them to claim that a irreversible breakdown in relations has happened between them, and therefore make them homeless, and then they go to a homeless shelter and then get an emergency housing. Is absolutely ridiculous. So that's even with refugees who actually do have, technically government and public sympathy. Yeah, I mean, the other part, what I think it'd be interesting what's going to happen, because the other reason Suella Braverman's there, and you can see this as well with Kemi Badenoch, is if they're going to do economic austerity again, or austerity, which is obviously very unpopular, that's when culture war stuff really comes into its own, doesn't it? Because the way of kind of, when you're making very unpopular cuts, and public opinion has shifted on austerity, because austerity had widespread acquiescence for a while because people thought there was no alternative. They blamed the last Labour government wrongly. But this time round, people are like, we've had years of this now, and actually you did this because you messed up the economy. This is all on you. So actually, I think they're going to ratchet up stuff, whether it be refugees, migrants, trans people, which is interesting. Because that for a long time, transphobia was a thing which circulated in the media, and this kind of well-connected cult on Twitter largely, but it's been taken up by right-wing Tory politicians with gusto, I'd say, in the last few months, actually. But that's what's going to happen, isn't it? Because what they'll do then is they think they can torture the opposition, because they think the opposition will they actually bet on this correctly, will wrap themselves up in knots, because that Labour will be too scared on trans rights or on refugees and migrants, because the Labour coalition includes people who think that we should have a progressive position and others who clearly don't. So they think it will cause a civil war within the Labour Party if they focus on that. And then the debate shifts away from cuts onto who can be more cruel to trans people and refugees.
Yeah, I mean, that does seem to be the strategy, doesn't it? I mean, if you look at Rishi Sunak's hires, that seems to be what's happening. Jeremy Hunt, you've got sort of this vision of competence. Obviously, he's going to cause lots of misery for lots and lots of people. Then you've got Suella Braverman in the Home Office. Kemi Badenoch is Minister of Equalities, isn't she? So, yeah, I mean, that's going to happen. Will it work? I suppose the difficulty is, and I think, Keir Starmer's response to some of this so far, which I think has been fine, the more effective end is, inflation is this much. Unemployment isn't high at the moment, actually. Inflation is this high. People's incomes are falling. Public services are at collapse. Why are we? The reason they're bringing up this is very transparent. I think if you give that kind of answer, that's probably the best way to get to the next general election. I would have thought, to say let's leave this to the experts. There are many people working in the NHS and working in all of these various institutions who are better placed than either me or Rishi Sunak to talk about trans healthcare. Let's just make sure everyone's supported. We're listening to the experts and talk about the issues that actually we are qualified to talk about, which is the economy, essentially. I mean, I think it's the economy stupid is probably how Labour should get to the next general election, not fighting on a sort of move to the right with the Conservatives. I mean, I think also, people say he should be taking them head on these issues. I suppose I am more of the sort of like try and reduce the salience of them and increase the salience of the economy, as opposed to like take the Tories head on. I don't know, we might disagree a little bit on that one.
Well, no, I think even like, if we're talking, I mean, look, we've got to be careful here because we're not trans, we're both cis men. But, I don't think the argument of trans people is, could you talk about this more, please, in politics? We'd like, because obviously this whole so-called debate, which is really horrible, bigoted media outlets and bigoted politicians whipping up a moral panic about a very, very small and embattled minority. And obviously it's not in the interest of trans people for that just to be pushed up the agenda at all. So I think, it's the same with gay rights in the 80s. I don't think the argument of gay people was, well, Labour need to make gay rights the absolute core of their kind of offer. It's just, the argument was they should support gay rights and then articulate a popular vision for the whole country that people can focus on, rather than endless debates about the existence of a minority. Just finally, because you know, we both we clawed our way through this. We've done all right. Look at him. Look
We're
at his
giving
little
ourselves
face.
a pass.
I think so. What do you see? I mean, we've got 2 years. So the election could be January 2015. So, oh God. Oh, dear. It's a lot of life to live under a Conservative government.
2025, January 2025.
Sure. I doubt, I mean, if they do that, that's going to be well annoying because they'd have to do an electoral campaign over Christmas. Could do without that, actually. Imagine that. Awful.
People might resent that.
Yeah, they might resent that. What do you think the Tory path through is? Because I think it would probably be they reduce inflation, more interest rates start to come down, and maybe they do some tax cut before the election, and hope that Labour doesn't have a clear cut through vision. That's their best bet, really, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be difficult. I mean, it's going to be very difficult for them to do. I mean, I suppose the obvious thing Rishi Sunak needs to do is, I suppose the bare minimum for him to do, which would, you know, he would still be seen, you know, to some degree as a success, is to stop the civil war in the Conservative Party, stop instability in the economy, because I think it's going to be very difficult to sort of be increasing everyone's living standards by the next general election. But you could have, you know, compared to the chaos of Liz Truss, I think he can calm that down. And that would probably be enough for the Tories to get, you know, above 30%, and then, you know, to get a respectable showing in a general election, but still lose. Potentially, you've got a sort of coalition government from the Labour Party, not this storming landslide, which would be the case if there was to be a general election now. Yeah, I suppose, how would he actually win? I mean, I think probably your suggestion was Rishi Sunak's plan, right? So Rishi Sunak wanted to become Prime Minister, do the sort of some of the tough decisions now, and then give people a 1p tax cut on the basic rate sort of in the months before a general election, and hope that would win even after sort of 12 years of a stagnating economy. I haven't seen the polling on this. I mean, obviously, I know when you ask people, would you like a 1p cut in the basic rate? They say yes. You know, obviously, that's popular. But I think you can make a strong argument that sort of like tax cuts isn't what we need right now. You know, I mean, the easy argument for Labour to make now is that we need to be taxing the rich and then support the Tories in their sort of cutting the basic rate. But I think, I mean, I wouldn't mind my taxes being higher. My big issue is I have to pay so much money to my landlord. You know, I pay £800 a month to my landlord for not very much. The fact that he was lucky enough to get a mortgage on the flat I happen to live in, I pay way less than that to the state. And then I get the health service, I get, you know, everything. So I don't necessarily think there is actually a strong public desire to have lower taxes at the moment. The costs that people see going up aren't their taxes. The costs people see going up are everything else.
Living costs. Yeah.
Living costs.
Yeah. It's a cost of living crisis. It's a coin of phrase. Michael, it's been a real pleasure. Thank you for, I think, holding my hand through this, I would say, to a large degree.
Always a pleasure. Always happy to do that, Harry.
It's a big honour. Obviously, you all follow Navarra, so I don't need to tell anyone to do that. But Navarra, great. Well done, Navarra. Well done for being so wonderful.
Thank you, Owen.
I'll see you soon. But lots of love, compañero. Fingers crossed for Brazil.
Fingers crossed for Brazil. Yeah, that's tense.
I'm actually quite worried about it, but we'll talk about it later. All right, lots of love, buddy. I'll see you soon.
All right, see you soon.
Lovely stuff there from Michael, as per usual. Yeah, so, Lula, here we go. I am doing a video tomorrow with someone from Brazil about the Brazilian election. So the latest polling was, I was a bit worried about it, actually, I have to say. It sort of put me in a, let me just look up quickly. It was too close for comfort, I would say, if I'm going to be brutally honest about it. Yeah, I mean, what's the latest poll say? That's a slightly better one, but oh dear, oh no. Final Brazilian poll aggregate, Bolsonaro 50%. Oh no, that's an earlier one. No, sorry, I don't want to panic everyone. Let's just, I'm going to come up with this quick. Oh, here we go. Last poll before the election, Lula 52%, down 1, Bolsonaro 48%, plus 1. That's a little close for comfort, isn't it? if we're going to be honest about it, I would be slightly concerned about that. Just because Bolsonaro, I mean, the reason maybe it's going to be okay is Bolsonaro's support was underestimated last time round, but only at the expense really of the other opposition candidates standing in the first round, whilst Lula's polling was kind of pretty much accurate. So that should hopefully mean in this context, maybe that's going to be okay. But I don't know, and I'm too worried about it to call that one, if I'm honest about it. It would be amazing. Obviously, you know, Latin America has shifted quite dramatically to the left over the last few years, having shifted to the right before that and shifted to the left before that. And, you know, it will mean if Brazil is, you know, Lula, the progressive candidate, wins, then Latin America will be dominated by very progressive governments. I mean, it's frustrating. You know, what's disturbing is the Bolsonaro movement, if you like, did well in the other elections in Brazil, as in for Congress and local elections and so on. So it's not like a one-off with Bolsonaro. There's a far-right movement which doesn't see its opponents as legitimate. And I suppose the concern is, given how close it, even if Lula wins, fingers crossed, is the big question marks over whether or not Bolsonaro will accept that result, will accept his defeat, and what his supporters will then do. And obviously, the closer the result, the easier it will be for him to mobilize his voters against the idea that it was a legitimate result. But look, we'll do a thing tomorrow. It'll be a slightly miserable video if Bolsonaro is won, I have to say, but I've committed to the video now. I can't really get out of it. But we'll get through it. But we'll do, you know, we'll have someone from Brazil, an expert who can talk us through that. But, you know, Lula, pull through. Just to quickly, there was a David Boata. Sorry, David, I'm not going to miss your question here. What do you think the chances are Labour actually offering a vision? Are they going to sit on the fence and hope for the best? Well, I think Labour are really offering a compelling, clear vision. No, I think, though, I mean, it's tricky, isn't it? It's tricky because what happened, obviously, is Keir Starmer reneged on his leadership bid, which I don't need to go through, but to be a kind of radical on domestic policy, but competent, and has hired a load of new Labour stooges and retreads, and obviously gone in that direction. The problem, of course, is New Labour. Obviously, I have a clear critique of New Labour. But at least New Labour was in a period of economic growth and rising living standards, which was not sustainable because it was the financial bubble. But the experiment they're trying to do here, I suppose, is New Labour in an era of massive acute social and economic crisis. Because as I've said, New Labour last time wasn't in that context. And kind of social peace was bought because of those rising unsustainable living standards. So I suppose the issue this time is, given Britain is in an absolute mess, if we're going to be honest about it, it's a disaster. If they don't offer transformative policies in this context, then, you know, they're just betting basically on people being so repelled by the Tories that they'll embrace the Labour Party. I think, you know, look, I always say the worst Labour government's better than the best Tory government, whatever that is. And, you know, they will do things which obviously are better than the Tories. They've said they'll do things like nationalise the railways. We'll see what they do about that. You know, they'll a sovereign wealth fund, which I think, you know, a public energy company. I mean, it's not nationalisation of energy, which Keir Starmer committed to in the leadership election. Yeah, I suppose they have to. If you don't define yourself, you're defined by your opponents. And I think what Rishi Sunak's lot are going to do is basically, as I said, use the Liz Truss experiment to attack the Labour Party, which seems completely deranged. But the whole point is they're going to go, well, this is what happens if you do an economic experiment. We have rejected the economic experiment. Rishi Sunak warned against that economic experiment, and we are providing stability. But Labour will again be a big risk. We'll go to that, back to mortgages soaring and all the rest of it. Do you want that to happen? That's what they're going to try and do. So Labour clearly, instead of, you know, if Labour keep talking about, I mean, I find it depressing for ages. They were going about the deficit. The Tories weren't talking about the deficit. It's like, why would you make an issue like that, which is actually, when you have a discussion about the deficit, never, you know, the Senate politics, that's not going to be good for Labour because people just think, oh, well, spending's bad then. Labour have to offer instead a clear vision that forces the Tories into a defensive position. Because, as I've said, if things like the deficit is the front and centre of political debate, it makes Labour more defensive because they're associated with public investment. Whereas if you put a vision based on social justice as the key political debate, that forces the Tories into a defensive position because then they have to argue against social justice. So that's Labour's real challenge. And I'm sceptical, I have to say, about them offering a clear vision. It may well be that the Tories have just completely effed it for themselves because of the disaster of the last few weeks, and nothing, people just made their minds up. They're like, this is a complete shambles and a disaster, and whatever I think about Rishi Sunak, I'm not voting Tory again. That's possible, and I think there's a good chance of that. So I think there's a significant chance Labour will form the next government, but it's definitely not in the bag. And the reason you can say that for sure is before the 1992 election, a lot of people thought that was in the bag for the Labour Party. And if you look at the polling, say in 89, 90, 91, Labour had massive leads, huge polling leads, like quite similar to now. And they won by-elections with like ridiculous majorities. And obviously the Tories eked out a victory in 1992. So I suppose that's the question: is like, will they? Are we gonna have a rerun of that? Back then, they got rid of Margaret Thatcher because the Tories are brutal in that sense. They were like, you may have handed us 3 whopping big victories in 3 general elections. You may have destroyed the opposition in terms of as a alternative vision for society. You've destroyed the post-war settlement. You've created a new society, essentially. But look, you're not an electoral asset anymore. We're getting rid of you. We'll replace you with dull, competent John Major. That's kind of what they're trying to do with Rishi Sunak, isn't it, really? They're trying to do that as a kind of, be their John Major. And I don't think Labour can succeed in repelling that attack unless they have a clear vision that puts the Tories on a defensive posture. Quickly, Rachel Atwood asked if Rachel, this is I'm speaking directly to Rachel Atwood, who asked if I'd put one of her friends, Igor, I think, on my show to talk gay rights in Russia. I would love to do that. Could you send me a direct message on Twitter? Because I would like to talk about LGBTQ issues in Russia at the moment. That's a very important point, I think. We have surpassed 200,000 subscribers, which I'm delighted about. In just the last month, 10,000 people have subscribed to the channel, which is great. We've had over 1.5 million people watching our videos in the last few weeks. And as I said, we've got a new strategy, I suppose, just doing lots of little mini videos and polemics kind of each day. On YouTube and Facebook, because obviously a lot of our audience is actually on Facebook, to be fair, and Instagram. I'm enjoying it. I think I found this therapeutic. I'm essentially using it as my therapy session. But honestly, it's been such an honor. Oh, the podcast is hot. Sorry, lots of people listen to this on the podcast. Not going to neglect the podcast. But honestly, I am, it's been a huge privilege and honor to do this. I learn a lot because obviously what's great about this kind of show, I think, or the channel, is you just get to chat to really interesting, informed people about issues, both domestically and internationally. So it's like having your own like lecture series where you just get these great, brilliant experts on the economy, on society, on all sorts of issues. And, so selfishly, I enjoy it. So I hope you all still enjoy it as well. We've got loads of videos in the next few days. Including an interview with someone from Brazil tomorrow, which I'm obviously, I said I'm excited about. I'm too nervous to be excited about it, if I'm honest with you. Anyway, look, cheers everyone. Press like and subscribe and hit the notification bell. I keep meaning to tell people this. If you click the notification bell, if you go to subscribe, you can see a bell and set it so you get notifications. So then you always get a notification when you get a video. So that would be helpful. And leave comments. Comments are great. If you leave comments, it helps the algorithm and then more people watch these videos. That's great. Yes, we'll be back live next Sunday, but with lots of stuff during the week. I hope you're all doing well in these unsettling times. Thanks for being great. I love reading your comments, and I've learned a lot from you as well. So, you know, it's a team effort. All right, everyone. Lots of love. Take care. I will see you very, very soon.